Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne Clemens, one of the pastors at Trinity United Methodist Church in Lafayette, Indiana. And it's a joy for me to be sharing the message today. Today's message is inspired by two passages of Scripture. The first passage I'm going to share with you today is from the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. And when he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them, and he bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you all may wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." And then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant, who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared, and set these before them. And while they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There, in the tent," he said. And then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Well, now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. And Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. And so Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is this old, will I now have this pleasure?" And then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord?' I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I didn't laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." And now our second reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 34 and 35, and then verse 40. And this is Jesus speaking to a crowd of people. "And then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in.' And the king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" Have you ever had the experience of being a stranger in another person's home? Well, when I was 23 years old, I had the unique opportunity to live with a family overseas, a family that I had not known before. And I lived with them for 6 months as their au pair, or their mother's helper. And it was an extraordinary experience, one that I will never forget. I lived with an American family in the south of France, taking care of their 2 children who were aged 3 and 18 months old. And the mother and I became the best of friends. And the father was an acclaimed artist. And he had lived off and on in Europe for a few decades, first as an apprentice of an Italian fresco painter, and then later as an artist who traveled and lived wherever he could find work. And his life really depended on the hospitality of patrons and friends, and this had helped shape in him a gracious hospitality. And Ben and Ella were truly outstanding hosts. We lived in this huge compound in a tiny rural French village, and only a handful of the 30 or so rooms in this compound had been renovated since earlier in the 20th century. But even so, the house was often full of people, models who were posing for artwork and their friends who were there. There were acquaintances who were just passing through the region. There were friends of friends who wanted to come for a visit. And the accommodations, even though this was a huge house, they were pretty modest. So there was only one bathroom, in the whole place, with one toilet and one shower. And the room that I had, I was the only person who actually had a room all to myself. Well, it was furnished with just one single bed, and there was one wardrobe that had hangers. But I didn't have a dresser or drawers or any furniture like that to put my things. So I basically lived out of the 2 suitcases that had traveled with me. And this place, like I said, was big, but in many ways it was just kind of bare bones. But what we had was a beautiful countryside and hospitality that was full of heart. About every night there were folks invited for dinner, and often there were new faces, people that I had not met before. And often they were people that Ben and Ella only knew tangentially, that they didn't know well themselves. But we ate by candlelight every night, and the food was amazing. And anyone and everyone was welcome. It was an adventure every night, and I met the most interesting people while I was there. We would dine sometimes until 10 or 11 in the evening. The wine or water, whatever people wanted to drink, was flowing. There was cheese platter and fresh bread every night at the end of every meal. And I remember this one occasion that there was an Italian visitor named Giovanna there. And she had remarked this particular evening on a scarf that was in the house that had caught her eye. And later in the night, Ben presented it to her and gave it to her as a gift. He wanted her to have it. And I could see the joy in him as he gave it to her. This was someone who just wanted people to feel welcome in his home, and he wanted to treat them lavishly. And he loved encountering people, meeting people, saying yes to people, and inviting them into his life. And I was forever changed by the summer that I spent in France with this wonderful family that treated me like one of their own. And the experience nurtured in me curiosity about cultures and people different from me, and also a fearlessness of exploring new places and encountering new people. I witnessed the joy of flinging doors wide open for others without a care for the state of house cleaning or whether or not you had matching dinner plates. The people who sat around Ben and Ella's table usually didn't know each other or have much in common, but it didn't matter. There was a spirit of openness and kindness that connected us across our unfamiliarity. And I also remember that my father had been terrified for me to take this opportunity and go so far away from home. He didn't know my host. We didn't know them beforehand. He didn't trust them. And he actually tried to stop me from going. But I took a leap of faith, and I've always been so grateful that I took that chance. My heart grew bigger and wider because of it, because of the hospitality that was extended to me. And I don't know about you, but I am just drawn to people who have the hospitality of heart that I've been describing. This is a kind of hospitality that transcends how we usually think about hospitality today. When we talk about hospitality, we're often thinking about welcoming friends or family, people that we already know well, not strangers. And the focus is on entertaining and making a good impression. And I'm guilty of often declining to invite people into my home because I've not had time to make it or myself, presentable in the way that I feel is expected. Too often, I get stalled by our contemporary Western ideas about hospitality that focus on status and appearance, and a capacity for entertaining. And I neglect what hospitality should be about, which is humble and other-centered care for another person. Now, the Bible is overflowing with stories of individuals encountering and welcoming guests or strangers. And to understand biblical hospitality, we have to set aside our contemporary American thinking about this topic. In the ancient Near East, travel was frequent and risky and dangerous, and people often had to go through unfamiliar places. So there was this cultural expectation that you were obligated to welcome and to provide for any stranger who showed up in your midst. It was a known custom, a social contract, if you will. And, because one day this could be you. So you were required to respect and to extend hospitality to any visitor. A stranger was kind of automatically to become your invited guest. And we see in the story of Abraham and Sarah, this kind of hospitality happening. So Abraham sees people that he doesn't recognize on the horizon, and it's not an option for him to ignore them. He doesn't wait around to see if they might go away. He doesn't glance at them and then look away, trying to stay focused on what he's already doing. No, at the first sight of newcomers, he stops what he's doing, and their well-being becomes his affair of the day. He reorients his and Sarah's activity and his rhythm to focus on them, to feed them, to provide rest, to serve them, to make sure that they are given the very best care. His hospitality is authentic and generous. If you translate that measurement of flour, when he tells Sarah to go knead bread, they're making bread for, oh my gosh, like a crowd. It's a huge amount there that they are dealing with. So he is motivated and energized by a desire to make these people, right, strangers that he's never met before, the most important part of his day. It's an urgent matter for him. His purpose is to serve them. And Abraham and Sarah, they've had no heads up to prepare for this moment in advance, except that is, they've cultivated already a habit of heart that sees a stranger and is ready at a moment's notice to make space for him or her and to provide the very best care and attention. We find that in Scripture, hospitality of the heart is deeply ethical and deeply moral. And more than that, it somehow also links us to God. In both our Old Testament and New Testament readings, the encounter with a stranger is an encounter with the divine. It's a holy encounter. And it's a risky encounter because you don't know who this person is or what's going to happen. The act of hospitality is an act of faith. And what we see in Scripture over and over again is the blessing and goodness that is the outcome of hospitality. In the story of Abraham and Sarah, their hospitality to the three strangers who end up being angels, well, it opens the blessing of a son in their old age. Their blessing is the gift of hope. The angels are there representing God right there in their midst. The first generation of Christians believed that when they welcomed a stranger and offered hospitality, that they were actually receiving the risen Christ among them. And what that meant is that they actually became known for this extravagant hospitality, so much so that in early Christianity, one of the Roman emperors in the first century commanded the Roman leaders under his authority to copy the ways of the Christian communities in order to grow the Roman Empire. You see, the Christians were demonstrating such remarkable kindness and generosity to everyone, and their hospitality stood out in their culture so much so that it was like a beacon that everyone was drawn to. And the political leaders of the time were actually saying, we need to be more like that. Go and do that. Marjorie Thompson defines hospitality like this. She writes that hospitality means receiving the other from the heart into my own dwelling place. It entails providing for the need, comfort, and delight of the other with all of the openness, respect, freedom, tenderness, and joy that love itself embodies. And I think that's a beautiful definition. And in describing what it means to open up our dwelling places, Thompson also thinks of this broadly. Surely our dwelling places are physical spaces, right? At Trinity, it would include our sanctuary, our great room, our lawn, our front porch with a swing and our free little library, and the virtual space that we call Trinity Connect. For you, it may also be your living room or your dining room, your patio or your backyard. And more than that, it's also the mental or emotional space that we open up and share with others. We open up our thoughts and our feelings, and we invite others to share their interior space so that they can be heard and to reveal themselves in whatever way they choose, without judgment, without any expectation that they're going to change, and even without any expectation that they're going to become our friend. Hospitality at its heart is an act of love centered on the other with no agenda other than the sharing of the best of what we have and who we are genuinely in order to meet the needs of the other. And how in the world do we do that? It seems so simple and straightforward, but we know that it is hard for us to love in this way. So foundationally, it's a love that has its source in God and is born out of our love for God. Because first, we have to know that we are loved, and we have to rest in and be rooted in that love. And that was really the focus of last Sunday's sermon when we remembered our baptism. Only when we recognize that love in us can we extend it to others. And God does still, I believe, desire for us to seek the stranger and to care for those who are different from us, those who we find ourselves separated from. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Observed in an address he carried out back in 1962, he said, "I am convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other, and they don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other, and they don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other." Think of all the ways now that we live today as strangers to each other. All the ways that we separate and we create unbelonging. And, we recognize the dividing lines. Some are stark and some are subtle, but we all move through them, through the world, and we're shaped, I think, more than we would like to admit by our locations and by the distinctions among us. And I'm thinking of distinctions such as between those who are churched or grew up in the church and those who didn't, that we sometimes call the unchurched. Blue state versus red state. The economic haves and the have-nots. We have rural versus urban, progressives versus traditionalists, and now vaxxers versus anti-vaxxers. And I think that deep down that we're hungering for a spirit of hospitality that says, my door is fully open to you regardless of your zip code or your status or your affiliation with any of these things, because you are a child of God. How can I be open to you? How can I care for you? You can trust me with your truth. And my friends, if we can offer that kind of hospitality, people will notice. They will be drawn to it. If others can see that kind of heart in us, they'll want to get closer to it, because that is the shape of God's heart, shining in us, vulnerable, inviting the stranger in. With God's help, may we continue to grow together in heart and in hospitality.